title. My son broke my ribs after I refused to give him the money from selling my farm. But then, when you've built your life on love and loyalty, betrayal doesn't just wound you. It shatters the very ground beneath your feet. What happens when a mother discovers that the children she raised to cherish honesty and compassion see her only as a bank account? Stay until the end, because this story will make you question how far forgiveness can really go. Margaret Preston had lived her 65 years with grace, wealth, and quiet strength. Her late husband, Richard, had built a successful real estate empire, and when he passed, Margaret found herself the owner of a sprawling estate outside Boston. Manicured gardens, white marble halls, everything a woman could need to grow old in peace. She'd sold one of the company's old properties the year before, earning a sum that made her the quiet envy of her social circle. She thought she'd spend her final decades hosting garden luncheons and funding her sister's cancer foundation. But peace never lasts long when greed is in the air. It began subtly. A few tense phone calls from her son, Michael, his voice carrying the familiar tremor of financial desperation. "Mom, I just need a little help," he'd said, his words slurred from another night of whiskey and failed poker games. Then Patricia, her daughter, followed suit. "Mom, Aaron and I are drowning in bills. Just a small loan until tax season." Margaret helped at first. A check here, a wire there. But the requests never stopped. By the time autumn leaves turned red, they weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. The night everything collapsed, the air was heavy with rain. Margaret had just finished her tea when headlights swept across her driveway. She frowned. Unannounced visitors were rare. When the doorbell rang, she straightened her robe and went to answer. Patricia stood there, her face pale under the porch light. Beside her, Michael reeked of alcohol, and behind them, Michael. Margaret said slowly, her tone calm but cold. "What are you doing here?" He smirked. "We're here to settle things, Mom." Her heart sank. "Settle what?" "The money," he said. "You sold Dad's property. That money belongs to all of us." Margaret's voice hardened. "That sale was my decision, Michael. Your father left the estate to me, not you." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You always loved control more than family." Patricia stepped forward nervously. "Mom, we just need you to transfer part of the funds. Aaron says." Margaret cut her off. "Aaron, is he behind this too?" Michael slammed his hand against the wall, making her flinch. "We're done begging, Mom. You either transfer the money tonight, or you'll regret it." Before she could respond, one of the strange men grabbed her arm. The shock of the touch stole her breath, and pain shot through her ribs as Michael shoved her backward. She fell against the marble floor, her head spinning, her body screaming in protest. It was Patricia's voice that broke through the haze. "Michael, stop! You're hurting her." But her son didn't stop, not until the distant wail of sirens split the night. The intruders bolted, Patricia froze, and Margaret, gasping for air, saw red and blue lights wash over the walls of her home. 2 police officers stormed in. Within minutes, Michael was in handcuffs, shouting, "Mom, I didn't mean to." "It's too late, Michael," she cried, every word slicing through her like glass. "It's too late to be sorry." The next hours blurred together, the paramedics, the hospital, the flashing cameras outside her gate. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Margaret caught sight of her son in the patrol car. For the first time in years, his eyes showed remorse. But it was hollow, too late to matter. At the hospital, as doctors confirmed 2 fractured ribs, Margaret stared at her reflection in the small mirror by her bed. A woman of elegance and discipline now looked like a ghost of herself. Grace, her oldest friend, arrived breathless and distraught. "Margaret, my God, what happened?" "My son happened," she whispered. "And my daughter let it." Grace clasped her hand tightly. "You have to press charges." "I will," Margaret said. "I'm done protecting people who hurt me." Later that night, an officer entered with a clipboard. "Mrs. Preston, I know this is difficult, but I need a full statement." Margaret took a slow breath and told him everything. The months of manipulation, the threats, the fear that grew inside her own home. When he finished writing, he looked up and asked quietly, "Do you wish to press formal charges against your son?" She hesitated only a moment before answering, "Yes." For everything. The attack, the threats, the lies, all of it. Hours later, when the room was silent again, her phone rang. Patricia's name flashed on the screen. Margaret's hands trembled as she answered. "What do you want, Patricia?" Her daughter's voice broke. "Mom, please. I never meant for this to go so far. You watched it happen. I didn't know he'd hurt you." "Mom, we just wanted a chance." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but fury. "Chance. To rob your mother, to declare me incompetent." Patricia's sobs filled the line. "Mom, Aaron said it was just business. I swear I didn't know." "Don't say his name to me again. You made your choice. Please don't send Michael to prison." Patricia pleaded. "He just needs help." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart heavy but resolute. "Your brother made his own bed. Now he'll sleep in it." She hung up and lay in silence, her ribs aching, her heart colder than ever. When her lawyer visited the next morning, he told her what she already knew. The two men had confessed. Michael faced charges of elder abuse, fraud, and assault. And Patricia, she'd be investigated too. That afternoon, Aaron showed up uninvited at Grace's home, where Margaret was recovering. Grace went pale. "Margaret, should I call the police?" "No," Margaret said. "Let him in." Aaron stepped into the room, hands clasped nervously. "Mrs. Preston," he said quietly, "I came to tell you the truth." She regarded him coldly. That would be a first. He swallowed hard. "I was the one who pushed them. We were drowning in debt. I thought if we convinced you to share the money, it would save us." Margaret's voice was icy. "So your solution was to ruin your wife's mother?" "I never wanted violence," Aaron said. "I'll testify. I'll help you. I need you to know Patricia loves you." She was desperate. Margaret's expression softened just for a moment. "Desperation doesn't excuse betrayal." "I know," he said. "But please, don't destroy her completely. She's lost enough." Margaret stared at him, her eyes calm but fierce. She destroyed herself the moment she stood and watched her mother bleed. Aaron left in silence. That night, Margaret sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer beyond Grace's garden. The pain in her ribs pulsed, but beneath it burned something stronger: resolve. She'd been their victim once. That would never happen again. The morning sunlight streamed through Grace's tall windows, glinting against the crystal vases and casting quiet warmth across the room. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch, a silk robe wrapped around her fragile frame, her tea untouched. She'd barely slept, not from pain. The doctors had given her enough medication for that, but because her mind refused to stop working. Grace entered quietly, carrying a tray of breakfast. "You should eat," she said softly. Margaret glanced at her but didn't move. "I'm done being weak, Grace. I've lived too long letting people mistake my kindness for fragility." Grace sighed, setting the tray down. "You're recovering, Margaret. Healing isn't weakness." "Then tell me," Margaret said, her voice cold but steady, "what does strength look like to a woman my age? Because last week, it looked like my son breaking my ribs while my daughter watched." Grace hesitated, unable to respond. Margaret rose slowly and walked toward the window, staring out at the manicured hedges and the long drive beyond. "I gave them everything: education, security, trust. And they gave me betrayal. I'm not going to let that be the final chapter of my life." Grace studied her friend's face, the sharp lines of determination there. "What are you going to do?" Margaret turned slightly, her expression calm but lethal. "I'm going to remind them that they weren't raised by a fool." That afternoon, she called her attorney, Mr. Berman. "Freeze the accounts I share with Patricia, move my personal assets into a private trust under my sole control, and find out who's been helping Michael with bail." Berman hesitated. "You're certain about this? It'll destroy whatever relationship remains." Margaret smiled faintly. "There's nothing left to destroy." Within a day, Michael's bail was revoked. The funds traced back to Patricia's account, now frozen under legal review. Patricia called in tears, screaming that Margaret was ruining their lives. Margaret listened quietly, then said, "You ruined mine first," and hung up. She felt no satisfaction, only clarity. Revenge wasn't about rage anymore, it was about restoring balance. 3 weeks later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed: journalists, socialites, neighbors. Margaret entered in a cream-colored suit, pearls at her throat, every step deliberate and regal. The room hushed. Even Michael looked away when she passed him. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the case in sharp detail: the assault, the conspiracy, the financial coercion. Margaret listened, hands folded neatly in her lap. When it was her turn to testify, she stood tall. "I raised my children to believe that integrity mattered more than wealth," she said, her voice steady. carrying through the silent room. But I learned that greed doesn't just take your money, it takes your soul. My son and daughter forgot who they were, so I'm here to remind them. When she finished, the courtroom was still. Even the judge seemed moved. Outside, cameras flashed as she left the courthouse. One reporter shouted, "Mrs. Preston, do you have any message for your children?" As she paused at the top of the steps, her chin lifted. "Yes," she said. "Never mistake a mother's love for permission." That line would be replayed on news broadcasts for days. But Margaret wasn't done. She'd already begun working quietly behind the scenes. Through her lawyer, she purchased the mortgage on Patricia's home, the same one Patricia had begged her to help refinance months ago. And when the payment deadline came, Margaret didn't extend it. The bank sent the foreclosure notice 2 weeks later. Patricia arrived at Grace's estate in tears, pounding on the door. Margaret opened it herself. "How could you?" Patricia cried. "You bought my house just to take it from me." Margaret's eyes were calm, unreadable. "No, I bought it so no one else would. But I did take it. Because I wanted you to know what it feels like to lose something you thought you'd always own." Patricia's voice broke. "You're destroying your own family." "No," Margaret said softly. "I'm saving what's left of it. Me." Patricia sank to her knees, sobbing. Margaret didn't move. After a long moment, she said, "You should go. You'll get a small settlement from the estate when I die. Until then, you'll work for what you want." As Patricia left, Grace stepped out from the sitting room, her face pale. "That was cold, Margaret. It was necessary," Margaret said. "You don't teach loyalty with warmth. You teach it with loss." That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. A knock came at the door. Unexpected, firm. It was Aaron. "Margaret," he said, voice trembling. "I came to tell you something. Patricia's falling apart. She's talking about leaving the country, maybe taking the kids." Margaret's eyes hardened. "She won't go far. She has nowhere to run that I can't reach." Aaron hesitated, then pulled a folded envelope from his jacket. "Michael wrote this from prison. He wanted me to give it to you." Margaret stared at it but didn't take it. Read it. Aaron opened the letter and began. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to answer. I just want you to know that when I hit you, I hated myself more than I hated you. I see your face every night. I wish I could take it back." Aaron looked up. His broken Margaret. She stood silently, her face expressionless. "So was I." Aaron tried again. "Maybe forgiveness could heal both of you." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Forgiveness doesn't heal people who never learned guilt." After he left, she finally picked up the letter. Her hands trembled. Not from pain, but memory. She read it twice, then burned it in the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the ink disappearing into ash. By winter, Patricia's house was sold. Margaret donated the profits to the local shelter for women recovering from domestic abuse, in her daughter's name. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her lawyer warned her, "If you keep pushing them, they'll hate you forever." Margaret smiled faintly. "They already do. Now I'm just giving them reasons to remember why." But beneath her composed surface, something deeper stirred. The faint achy of motherhood, the quiet grief of a woman who'd lost everything she'd built to the people she loved most. Still, she refused to let regret rule her. One evening, Grace found her sitting alone by the piano, her fingers tracing the keys. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" Grace asked gently. Margaret looked up, her eyes distant. "Every day. But wondering doesn't change the truth. Some debts can only be paid in pain." Grace nodded quietly, understanding more than she said. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the garden in white. Margaret rose, straightened her shoulders, and whispered to herself, "They took my peace. I took their comfort. We're even now." But deep down, she knew the game wasn't over, not yet. Winter gave way to early spring, and with it, Margaret's house returned to silence. The headlines had faded, the trial was over, and the world had moved on. But Margaret hadn't. Her son was serving time, her daughter was bankrupt, and for the first time in years, she could finally breathe. Or at least, she thought she could. The night Grace invited her to a charity gala downtown, Margaret almost refused. She hadn't been out in months, but Grace insisted. "You can't live in exile forever," she said. "You're stronger than the ghosts in that house." So Margaret went. She wore a midnight blue gown, her hair swept into an elegant twist, pearls glimmering against her collarbone. When she entered the ballroom, heads turned, not out of gossip, but awe. Margaret Preston had always carried herself like royalty, even when the world tried to crown her victim. As she greeted old acquaintances, she noticed a familiar figure near the bar. Tall, composed, a man with graying hair and a kind, searching face. Daniel Whitmore. He introduced himself when their eyes met. "We met once. At Richard's fundraiser years ago." Margaret's memory flickered. "You're the attorney from Whitmore and Rowe." "Guilty," he said with a smile. "I wanted to say how much I admired your strength during the case. Not many people could survive what you did, and still walk in here with their head high." Margaret's lips curved faintly. Survival is a habit now. They spoke for hours. He was kind without pity, confident without arrogance. For the first time since her husband's death, Margaret felt something shift, not love, not yet, but the quiet hum of possibility. Over the next few weeks, Daniel visited often. They'd share tea in her garden or dinner by the fire, talking about art, travel, and the strange fragility of human trust. Grace teased her endlessly. "Don't tell me the Ice Queen's heart is thawing." She'd laugh, but Margaret only smiled. "I'm not melting, Grace. I'm remembering how to feel." Then, one night, Daniel brought news that changed everything. "Margaret," he said, setting down his glass, "I've been reviewing a few of your late husband's old accounts. The ones linked to the estate. Did you know someone's been trying to access them?" Margaret frowned. "That's impossible. Everything was closed years ago." "Not all," he said gently. "There's a small offshore account under your name. Except the access request didn't come from you. It came from Patricia." Margaret's face went cold. She wouldn't dare. "I thought you'd want to know," Daniel said carefully. "I can block the transaction." "No," Margaret said slowly. "Let her try. I want to see how far she'll go." That night she sat alone in her study, watching the rain streak down the windows. Patricia had vanished months ago, claiming she needed space. Margaret had assumed the silence meant surrender. She was wrong. 2 days later her lawyer called. "Mrs. Preston, there's been a transfer attempt for over $200,000, but the request didn't go through. Your authorization code blocked it." Margaret exhaled sharply, anger simmering beneath her calm surface. Find her. It took only a week. Patricia was living in a rented house in New Hampshire with her children, and Aaron, whose debts had multiplied since losing their home. Margaret arrived unannounced, her driver parking discreetly down the street. When Patricia opened the door, shock crossed her face. "Mom." Margaret stepped inside, her heels clicking on the worn floorboards. "You've been busy." Patricia's voice shook. "I didn't steal anything. I just needed." "You needed what?" Margaret snapped. "Another chance to bleed me dry." Tears welled in Patricia's eyes. "I made a mistake, I know that. But the kids." Margaret raised a hand. "Don't you dare use them as an excuse. I gave you enough to live comfortably. Instead, you chose lies over redemption." Aaron emerged from the kitchen, his expression wary. "Mrs. Preston, please." She cut him off sharply. You're the same man who promised me Patricia would be safe, that you'd keep her from this madness." Aaron's jaw tightened. "We didn't plan this." Patricia was desperate. "Desperation is a choice," Margaret said coldly. "And you've both made yours." She turned to her daughter, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "You wanted my money so badly. Fine. You'll get it, just not the way you think." That night, Margaret returned home and made several quiet phone calls. The next morning, Patricia's accounts were frozen again. Her car, leased under Margaret's name, was repossessed. And within a week, Aaron's business license was revoked, the result of unpaid taxes uncovered by a random audit. Grace watched from the sidelines, worried. "You've proved your point, Margaret. Isn't that enough?" Margaret looked out the window, her eyes distant. "No, not yet. Revenge is about justice, not pain. And justice isn't finished." When Michael's prison counselor called to request a family reconciliation meeting, she agreed. Not because she wanted peace, but because she needed closure. The visit took place in a sterile room under flickering lights. Michael entered in handcuffs, thinner, older, haunted. He wouldn't meet her gaze. "Mom," he said finally, "I've been sober for months now. I think about that night every day." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "Good. You should. I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." She studied him for a long time. Do you remember the day I taught you to ride a bike? He blinked in surprise.
Yes.
You fell 6 times, she said. But I told you not to quit. You got back up every time. I raised you to stand tall, not to break people to get what you want. His eyes filled with tears. I lost everything, Mom. Margaret's gaze softened slightly. So did I. When she left, she felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not pity, but relief. The wound was still there, but it had stopped bleeding. Months passed. Daniel remained by her side, quietly steady, helping her rebuild what the storm had broken. She sold one of her smaller estates and started a foundation in her husband's name, one focused on helping victims of family exploitation and elder fraud. At the opening ceremony, cameras flashed as she stepped up to the microphone. Her voice carried through the hall, calm, composed, unyielding. Family, she said, is supposed to be our safest place. But when greed walks in, love walks out. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about letting others go free. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their betrayal. The audience rose in applause. That night, Daniel took her hand as they stood by the balcony, overlooking the glittering city. You did it, he said softly. You turned pain into power. Margaret smiled faintly. No, I turned betrayal into legacy. Below them, the city lights shimmered like distant stars, each one a reminder of what she'd survived, what she'd reclaimed. And somewhere out there, her children were watching the news, hearing her words. They'd lost everything she'd given them. But in that loss, Margaret had found herself again. She turned to Daniel, her voice low and certain. People think revenge is about destruction, she said. But for me, it was about creation. I didn't ruin them. I showed them who they really were, and who I've always been. He looked at her, admiration in his eyes. And who is that? Margaret smiled, lifting her glass. A woman who finally stopped saying sorry. The night stretched on, calm and endless. Margaret felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders at last. She wasn't the woman they'd tried to break anymore. She was the woman who'd learned how to rebuild. Stronger, sharper, and untouchable. And as the final note of a distant piano echoed through the quiet estate, she whispered to herself, "Revenge didn't make me cruel. It made me whole. Perfect." I'll continue right from the end of part 3, keeping Margaret's world elegant, her tone unbreakable, and the revenge still simmering beneath her calm exterior. This new chapter will reveal how success draws back the ghosts she thought she'd buried, leading to the next twist in her story. Months after the Foundation's launch, Margaret Preston had become a name whispered in admiration throughout the city. The Preston Hope Foundation was featured in magazines, praised for its mission, and applauded for turning tragedy into triumph. Photographers adored her poise, journalists quoted her grace, and donors lined up to shake her hand. But beneath the charm of galas and speeches, Margaret never forgot the cost of her peace. Every click of a champagne glass echoed a betrayal. Every smiling face reminded her of the ones that once looked at her with deceit. It was late one evening when her assistant, Clara, entered the office with a worried expression. "Mrs. Preston, someone's been leaving letters at the gate. No return address, just your name on the envelope." Margaret paused mid-signature. "How many?" "4 this week alone. I thought they were donation inquiries, but..." Clara hesitated, handing her the stack. Margaret opened one. Inside was a single line written in neat cursive. "You built your fortune on the ruins of others. How long before the cracks show?" Another reads, "Revenge never ends, Margaret. It just changes hands." Her pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. "Destroy the rest," she said quietly. That night, as she sat by the fire with Daniel, she mentioned it casually, as if discussing the weather. "Anonymous letters," she said, sipping her wine. "Someone thinks I'm being haunted by karma." Daniel studied her carefully. "And are you?" She met his eyes. "No, I am karma." He smiled at her defiance, but she could see the concern behind it. "Still, you should let me have my firm look into it." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," she replied. But a week later, she had reason to reconsider. It was nearly midnight when her phone buzzed. The security team had caught someone on the property cameras. A woman, standing at the edge of the gate, staring at the house for over 20 minutes before disappearing into the trees. Margaret reviewed the footage herself. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. Patricia, her breath caught. Patricia looked thinner, broken, almost unrecognizable. Grace arrived the next morning and found her friend sitting in the conservatory, the letter on her lap. "She's back," Margaret said. Grace frowned. Patricia, after everything. I think she wants something again. Grace sighed. Then call the police. Margaret shook her head slowly. No, I want to know why first. 2 days later, Patricia appeared, not at the house, but at the Foundation's downtown office. She waited in the lobby for nearly an hour before Margaret finally agreed to see her. When Patricia entered, she looked exhausted. Her hair was dull, her clothes faded. Mom, she began softly, I didn't come for money. Margaret gestured for her to sit. Then why are you here? I came to tell you that Aaron's gone. Margaret's tone stayed cool. Gone. Had disappeared 3 weeks ago. The people he owed money to. They came after us again. I thought it was over, but it wasn't. And now I'm scared, Mom. They said if I don't pay by the end of the month, they'll come for me. And the kids. Margaret leaned back, her face unreadable. So now you remember who your mother is. Tears filled Patricia's eyes. I know I don't deserve your help. But please, Mom, I don't have anyone else. Silence stretched between them, heavy and merciless. Finally, Margaret spoke. You created this storm, Patricia. You let greed ruin everything. But I won't let your children pay for your sins. Patricia's breath caught in relief. Thank you, Mom. Don't thank me yet, Margaret interrupted coldly. You'll do exactly as I say. The next day, Daniel arranged a private investigator to track down Aaron's debtors. Within a week, they discovered the network. A small group of men running an illegal gambling ring. Daniel recommended police involvement, but Margaret refused. I'll handle it my way, she said. Her way was quiet, precise, and devastating. A series of anonymous tips led the authorities to the ring's warehouse. The operation was dismantled within 48 hours. Arrests were made, assets seized, and names splashed across newspapers. What no one ever knew was that the tip came from Margaret's own desk. When Patricia heard the news, she arrived at Margaret's house in tears. You saved me, she sobbed. You saved my children. Margaret looked at her evenly. No, Patricia. I saved mine. That night, alone by the fireplace, Margaret stared into the flames. Grace called her later. You did the right thing, she said. Did I? Margaret murmured. Because every time I save them, I lose another piece of myself. Grace was silent for a long moment. Maybe revenge isn't about winning anymore. Maybe it's about finally letting go. Margaret smiled faintly. Letting go is easy for people who were never betrayed. But deep down, she wondered if Grace was right. Weeks later, the Foundation hosted another event, this time for women who had rebuilt their lives after family exploitation. Patricia volunteered quietly, arranging flowers and handing out programs. She never asked for thanks, and Margaret never offered any. But as she watched her daughter speak kindly to a survivor, something softened in her. Patricia was trying, truly trying, maybe for the first time in her life. After the guests left, Patricia approached her. Mom, she said softly, I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to help here, at the Foundation. It's the least I can do. Margaret studied her for a long time. If you mean it, you'll earn your place. Like everyone else. Patricia nodded. I understand. That night, Margaret wrote her a letter. She never gave it to her, but she placed it in her desk drawer, right beside the old anonymous ones. You hurt me in ways you'll never fully understand. But every time I look at your children, I remember that love, no matter how wounded, is still love. I won't forget what you did. But maybe someday, I'll remember who you were before all this. She closed the drawer and exhaled, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not entirely, but release. The rain began to fall softly outside, washing the city clean. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel the weight of her past pressing against her ribs. She had won. Not through cruelty, but through control. Through the kind of power that doesn't scream or demand, but simply exists. The news broke quietly, almost as an afterthought in the business pages. Daniel Crawford under federal investigation for financial misconduct. Margaret read the headline twice, her expression perfectly still. Across the breakfast table, Grace folded her paper. You knew something like this might come, she said. I didn't want to believe it. Margaret set down her coffee cup with care. He was my partner in everything. I let him into my home, my work, my life. Grace gave her a knowing look. You trusted him. That's your weakness, Margaret. You always think you can shape people into better versions of themselves. Margaret didn't answer. She simply looked out the window, where the morning sun filtered through the cypress trees. The foundation's annual charity gala was in 2 weeks. She couldn't afford a scandal. Not again. Later that day, she confronted Daniel in his office. He was sitting behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, staring at spreadsheets. "Tell me it isn't true," she said. He looked up, guilt flickering across his face before he forced a smile. "Margaret, it's an exaggeration. They're investigating a vendor, not me directly." She stepped closer, her voice cold and steady. "Then why does every trail lead back to your name?" He sighed. "You wouldn't understand. The board needed liquidity, and I made some aggressive calls. It's business. It's betrayal," she snapped. "You used the foundation to cover your debts. You made me the face of your fraud." Daniel rose, trying to soften his tone. "Listen, I'll fix it. You just have to trust me." "Trust," she whispered. "You've mistaken me for the woman I used to be." That evening, Margaret called her lawyer and ordered a full audit. Quietly, without alerting Daniel. What she discovered over the next week made her blood run cold. Offshore accounts, falsified invoices, hidden transfers, all under her foundation's name. Daniel hadn't just lied. He'd built his empire on her reputation. Grace came over that night, pouring them both whiskey. "You could go public," she said. "Expose him before he ruins you." Margaret shook her head. "No. Public scandals feed on sympathy. I don't want pity. I want precision." "What are you planning?" Margaret's eyes glimmered. "A reckoning." The next day, she invited Daniel for dinner. Candlelight, crystal glasses, the faint scent of jasmine in the air. He arrived nervous, trying to mask it with charm. "You look incredible," he said. She smiled faintly. "You always did appreciate presentation." They talked, laughed, reminisced, until dessert arrived. That's when she slid a sealed envelope across the table. "What's this?" "Your future," she said. He opened it. Inside were printed documents, evidence of every fraudulent transfer, every hidden asset, and a letter addressed to federal investigators. Daniel froze. "You wouldn't." "Oh, Daniel?" she said softly. "You still think you're the clever one. The letter's already been sent. I just wanted to see your face when the truth caught up." He stood abruptly, panic flaring. "You'll destroy everything. The foundation, your reputation, my reputation?" She interrupted, her voice like glass. "I built it. I can rebuild it. But you," she leaned forward, eyes sharp as knives, "you'll never recover from being the man who stole from a woman who trusted him." He tried to plead, but she didn't listen. "Leave," she said quietly, "before I call security." The next morning, the investigation widened. Daniel was suspended, his accounts frozen. Margaret made a statement to the press. Poised, calm, immaculate, she admitted oversight failures, accepted responsibility, and pledged full cooperation. Public sympathy turned toward her instantly. Grace watched the coverage with a slow smile. "You've turned scandal into strategy." Margaret sipped her tea. "Reputation is like silk. You can stain it, but if you know how to handle it, you can make people forget where the tear was." But just when she thought the storm had passed, another letter arrived. No address, no signature, just her name again. She opened it. "He wasn't your first betrayal. He won't be your last. The circle isn't closed yet." Margaret's hand trembled slightly. She looked out over her estate, the vast gardens, the stone fountain, the calm illusion she'd worked so hard to rebuild. Somewhere out there, someone still watched. Someone who knew her story wasn't over. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the old heat rise in her chest. Not fear, but fire. Grace called later. "You sound distant." "Everything all right?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice low, steady. "I just remembered something." "What's that?" "That piece," she said, looking into the darkened glass of the window, "isn't the end of revenge. It's just the pause before the next move." The line went quiet. Then Grace whispered, "Then I suppose it's time to play again." Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, and this time I'll make sure no one leaves the board alive." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain began to fall over the estate, slow, heavy, relentless. And in the reflection of the glass, Margaret's eyes burned with quiet resolve. The world might think she'd won her battles, but she knew better. The real war had only just begun. 3 months later, the city buzzed with gossip. Daniel Crawford had vanished before sentencing. Some said he fled to Europe, others swore he'd bribed his way out. Margaret didn't care which version was true. She had moved on. Or so she told herself. The Preston Hope Foundation was thriving again. Margaret's image graced magazines, her speeches quoted by senators. To the world, she was the picture of grace reclaimed. But late at night, she still read the anonymous letters she'd kept in her drawer. The handwriting had changed, sharper now, deliberate. Whoever sent them wasn't just an enemy, they knew her intimately. One afternoon, while reviewing new charity proposals, her assistant entered with a strange expression. "Mrs. Preston, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Margaret looked up. Ooh. The door opened before the answer came. A tall man in his 40s stepped in. Confident, calm, familiar. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. "Hello, Margaret," he said. It was Aaron, Patricia's ex-husband, the one she thought had disappeared. "I heard you've been busy," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the empire you've built." Margaret's voice stayed smooth. "You were supposed to be dead." He chuckled. "People are supposed to be a lot of things." He dropped a folder onto her desk. Inside were copies of her own letters, the ones she'd written but never sent. "You kept records," he said softly. "Careless for someone so meticulous." "What do you want, Aaron?" "Half," he said simply. "Half your foundation's profits. Consider it payment for keeping your secrets buried." Margaret rose slowly. "You overestimate your leverage." "Do I?" He leaned forward. "I know about Patricia, about how you arranged those arrests, about Daniel's downfall, and I have proof." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret smiled, small, dangerous. "You always were predictable, Aaron. You never learned to check who you were really threatening." She reached into her drawer and slid another envelope across the desk. Inside was a signed confession, his confession. Bank records, wire transfers, offshore accounts tied to his name. His face blanched. "How?" "You're not the first man to try to use me," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last. But you'll be the first to regret it this completely." By the next morning, Aaron was gone. His accounts frozen, his reputation shredded by an anonymous tip to the authorities. Patricia arrived in tears days later. "He's ruined again," she whispered. Margaret simply said, "He did that himself." That night, she stood alone on the balcony overlooking the garden. The city lights shimmered beyond the hills, and for the first time, the air felt still. No more letters, no more ghosts. Grace called. "You did it again, didn't you?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I simply finished what others started." "Does it ever end, Margaret?" Grace asked gently. She looked out at the horizon. "Revenge doesn't end," she said. "It evolves. It becomes who you are." The wind lifted her hair, carrying away the last trace of smoke from the past. She turned back toward the house. Marble floors, golden light, quiet power. In that silence, Margaret finally understood she hadn't been surviving revenge. She had become it. And somewhere deep inside, that realization felt like peace. She poured herself a glass of wine, raised it toward the dark, and whispered, "To what's mine, and what I've reclaimed." Then she smiled, slow and certain as the night swallowed the sound. Because in the end, Margaret Preston didn't need forgiveness. She was the consequence.